Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this sesh. Welcome to the Simios Papa sesh and our semi-regular online discussions with archaeology and fine arts in the Southeast Asian region. Before we start this sesh, I would like to invite our Center Director, Mrs. Somnak Sharanpot, to give a welcoming address.
Thank you. Thank you, Noel. And good morning and Swadika from Bangkok, our headquarters of Simios Papa. Talking about Simios Papa, when you heard of the word Simio is standing for Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization. And we are part of this organization. We are the regional center for archaeology and fine arts. What do? We promote the knowledge and information on archaeology. It was first introduced as the project to promote the work of archaeology, which become very useful in preserving our cultural heritage in the region. And later it was expanded to also the works of fine arts in order to include everything concerning cultural heritage to the center's responsibility. You have been familiar with our work through a lot of training programs, workshop, and also seminar and even conferences that we have conducted each year. We are almost 50 years of age. We plan to celebrate this center of ours in next year. So throughout this period, you might have been already joining in a lot of our programs. This Papa Sesh program has been our newest program that was thought about, created because of the situation that we are in right now. We already planned for our projects to be launched for this fiscal year in quite a few training workshop program, but they have to be all postponed to next year, we hope. But in the meantime, because we do not want our regional friends to be lack of knowledge or information on the subject that we are responsible for, that is archaeology and fine arts, and that will include the heritage preservation and conservation, and also creation in new style of art or fine arts and craft that can be turning into creative industry for the region. So therefore, we thought that instead of going around the region to do the project, we might as well join like other organizations, is to do it online. But our online project will be varied from seminar, lectures, discussions, or all kinds of platforms that will be appropriate to the subject. So last week, approximately, we have launched our first one on the preservation of old houses in one of the northern provinces in Thailand, because it was a hot issue in the country. Therefore, we thought we might as well start it with that topic. But because it's this topic that is well aware of and is interested by all the Thai public, therefore it was launched in Thai language. And it gives us some idea that maybe some other topic might be launched in different regional languages also. But we will have the summary of each topic in English after the program has been on air. So I mentioned about that last program is because SPAFA has been participated in the preservation of those houses 10 years ago. So we thought it's a good opportunity to celebrate the 10th year anniversary for that occasion, that we have a book printed out on the topic. And it's kind of an introduction for the unity of local people with other organizations in the work of preservation of national heritage. Today, since we have mentioned that archaeology is our priority of our mission, therefore we would like to start the English program, our first one, in the topic of archaeology, which is, I don't want to say this topic, Noel, because older sometimes is good, like me. So this one is older is not necessarily better. I let you say the whole name. We thank you, our panelists, both of you, Stephen and Marlon, to join in this discussion. I know this is a very interesting topic among the Philippines, the Filipinos and people. And as an archaeologist, I find that it's a very interesting topic, and I can't wait to hear all of your discussion. This session, well, I like to say something about SPAFA Sesh. We came up with the name SPAFA Sesh is because Sesh is a short word, but it's in a dictionary for session. So I think it's a very good name. That's why we call it SPAFA Sesh. And this SPAFA Sesh, this one, will be moderated by our senior specialist in archaeology, Dr. Noel Tan, who is very well known among all of you already. I think, I'm sure. He is also an archaeologist. He has studied archaeology throughout his bachelor's degree up to a PhD program. And we are very proud to have him as our senior specialist. And aside from that, he has his background in journalism. And I'm sure with his journalist background, I'm sure that this discussion will be a very interesting, because I think both Stephen and Marlon, he will use his expertise in investigative inquiry to ask you all of the information. So I like to give you the floor now. Noel, Dr. Noel Tan, Senior Specialist of Archaeology of SPAFA. Thank you, Noel.
Thank you very much, Director Samdak. And a very good morning to all of you. Welcome from Bangkok, from SPAFA, the Regional Center for Archaeology and Fine Arts. My name is Noel. I'm your moderator for this morning. And SPAFA Sesh is our monthly online discussion about Southeast Asian archaeology and fine arts. And if you'd like to find out more about our sessions and upcoming sessions, you can find out on our website, www.seniospafa.org/sesh. And also, If you're joining us from Facebook, please like us on Facebook. We're also on Twitter, Instagram, and we have a mailing list. We are broadcasting live on Facebook and also on Zoom this morning. So if you're on Facebook especially, leave a comment and tell us which city you are seeing us from. We'd like to hear from you and see where everybody is coming from. So some housekeeping before we start. Please feel free to leave questions anytime. Leave a comment, leave a question. If you're on Zoom, please use the Q&A function to leave a question. We've already gotten some, and we'll try to get as many as we can in this hour and a half that we have. But please leave questions anytime, and they will get fed to me, and we will ask Stephen and Marlon on that. This morning's sesh is, the full title of this morning's sesh is Older is Not Necessarily Better, the short history of the Ifugao Rice Terraces. And it's so not necessarily emphasizing about age. It's not a session about ageism, but it's a session about the Ifugao Rice Terraces in the Philippine Cordilleras, which are a national cultural treasure of the Philippines. And some of them are even designated as UNESCO World Heritage. And they were initially estimated to be around 2,000 years old, but recent work by our two guests today indicate that they are much younger and built around 400 or 500 years ago. And so what does these few dates of the Ifugao Rice Terraces mean for Philippine history and Ifugao? I'm joined by this morning by two friends of ours. They have been with us in our SPAFA events for a number of times, so they're familiar faces to us. And for some of you, I'm sure they're quite familiar too. Professor Stephen Acabado and Marlon Martin. Marlon is an Ifugao who leads a non-profit heritage conservation organization in his home province of Ifugao. He actively works with various academic and conservation organizations, both locally and internationally, in the pursuit of Indigenous studies, integration and inclusion in the formal school curricula. He established the first community-led Ifugao Indigenous Peoples Education Center, the first in the region, and he established it with our next guest, Professor Acabado, who is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Acabado directs the Bicol and Ifugao Archaeological projects and co-directs the Taiwan Indigenous Landscape and History Project. He is a strong advocate of an engaged archaeology where descendant communities are involved in the research processes. So I heard this yesterday, and so I should mention this. Stephen mentioned that Stephen and Marlon are kind of like a double act in community archaeology. Stephen's the archaeology and Marlon's the community. How's it? So I bid you good morning, Stephen and Marlon. How are you?
We're good. Buenas tardes in Los Angeles.
What time is it over there, Stephen?
It's 8 p.m., 8:14.
It's 8 p.m. Yesterday for us.
Yeah.
And Marlon, hello, how are you?
I'm good.
Where
Thank you, and hi
calling us
from Ifugao. Sorry?
Where are you calling us from?
From Ifugao province. It's almost noon here.
Cool. I'm so glad to have you with us in our session. I'm very glad that both of you are my first guests. Some of you might know that I'm also half Filipino, so this is a Filipino Represents episode of SPAFA Sesh. Perhaps I can start with a question for Marlon for the benefit of our viewers who may not be familiar with Ifugao, the Ifugao community. Marlon, could you tell us a bit more about the Ifugao, who they are, and about yourself and your place in it?
Right. The Ifugaos are one of 7 major ethno-linguistic groups in the Cordillera region in North Philippines. So we're more commonly known for or popularly known for our rice terraces. Officially, in the UNESCO list, our rice terraces is collectively called the rice terraces of the Philippine Cordilleras. The Cordillera is it's the region where the province of Ifugao belongs. But all the inscribed sites are located in the province of Ifugao. So we have we were known for our 2,000-year-old rice terraces until Stephen Acabado came along. Or well, there were earlier anthropologists actually who earlier stated that the rice terraces are maybe not that old, but the educational system in the Philippines and then followed by tourism perpetuated the idea that the rice terraces are 2,000 years old. Now we don't have that long community memory as to whether it's 2,000 years or perhaps even older, because of course in among indigenous peoples where you don't have a system of writing, time reckoning is not you don't count them by years. We know that it has been passed down to us for generations, but we never said it's 2,000 years. But anyway, the Ifugaos are quite a hardy people. We are called indigenous in the Philippines because primarily because we were not part of the Spanish colonized Philippines. It was only during the time of the Americans, about 100 years ago, that we participated in the national government system. So from the early 1900s up to now, we have been colonized by the dominant Filipino culture. But somehow the Ifugao culture is trying to, traditional Ifugao culture still trying to hold on despite all the changes that are going on around the province, and with people getting more and more mobile. We are people who are trying to hold on to our traditional customs, but at the same time also trying to move forward by joining the rest of the Philippine population.
How is the Ifugao culture different from the Filipino culture?
Majority of the Philippines was under Spain for 333 years. So, well, as you know, in Southeast Asia, we're like the only Christian country, Catholic foremost. So the general Filipino culture is Hispanized. The Ifugaos did not go through that stage of Philippine colonialism, which made most of our practices until now quite different from the rest of the country. There are several indigenous peoples groups in the Philippines who were not subjugated by Spain. So as of now, that's how we define indigenous peoples in the Philippines legally. These are people who have not undergone the Spanish colonial regime. So we are a bit different when it comes to the general Philippine culture. Of course, we identify ourselves as Filipinos.
Thanks. And so let's pivot to Stephen, because I know we had some materials prepared, Stephen. Could you tell me about the Ifugao Archaeological project and how did you end up working in this region?
Okay. Thank you, Noel, and thank you, Director Somlap. It's an honor to be here, and we're happy to share our almost more than a decade of work in Ifugao. The Ifugao Archaeological project started as part of my graduate school research. There's actually a story behind it, because I was taking a landscape archaeology class with Dr. Michael Graves, and I did a landscape analysis of the distribution of the rice terraces using GIS. This was a class in environmental archaeology, and I submitted a paper that he liked it a lot, that he gave me an incomplete. And he said that I won't get a completion grade unless I turn that paper into a thesis. So I took an incomplete for the summer and worked on improving the paper and coming up with a thesis. And so I got my MA based on the analysis of the Ifugao landscape using Harold Conklin's work. And then when I was preparing for my dissertation, since my dissertation, my PhD supervisor is working in Cambodia, it would have been an easier decision to work in Cambodia because she would have funding for me to do the research there. But I didn't have the time and resources to learn Khmer and French at the same time. And so I decided to go back and continue my work in Ifugao. It's also part of since I know that the history of the Ifugao dating, as I am a product of the Philippine educational system, I started to think about the 2,000-year-old model as something like an anecdotal model by earlier anthropologists, that they didn't really have any evidence that we can test whether the argument is right or wrong. So I started with a clean slate, trying to come up with a research design, a strategy to date an archaeological or an agricultural terrace system. And for most of us archaeologists, dating an agricultural feature is almost close to impossible. And so my dissertation started with developing a methodology to look at or establish a date for an agricultural system that can be applied anywhere else in the world. And also to look at how the landscape informs socio-political organization. And so that's when we started, I got started in Ifugao. That was in 2007. And then I went back in 2012. I met Marlon in 2011, but it wasn't until maybe 2014, 2013 that he bought into the program.
Would you like to show us your slides and go into the what you found for the Ifugao dates?
Okay. So I prepared a short presentation here just to provide a background on what we've done so far. And so please remind me, I promise to shut up in 5 minutes. So older is not necessarily better. There was already a question about it. And this is not referring to a disrespect for older people or for all things old. But this is something about breaking the myth of the romanticized deep history, that the romance of archaeology is about looking for everything old. But sometimes younger findings are actually more meaningful, but because we can still relate to the findings. So the basis of the title, again, it's telling because it questions it refutes the 2,000-year-old model for the origins of the rice terraces in the northern Philippines. For those of you who are not familiar where Ifugao is, it's right in the middle of the Philippine Cordilleras. So in the middle of Luzon, that's a mountain range, and Ifugao is highlighted in this map. The Ifugao is one, as Marlon mentioned, is one of the 7 major ethno-linguistic groups in the region. But when we talk about the Ifugao, it's not a monolithic group. There are several ethno-linguistic groups in Ifugao who identify themselves as Ifugao, but there are variations, and Marlon can then talk more about it. So the Ifugao is famous for the rice terraces, and you can judge for yourself. These are some photos that we've taken in the last 5 years. But going back to the debate, I actually won't use the term debate now. I'm changing it to discussions, because we have to move beyond the dating of the rice terraces, because when we talk about the older dates, then we're romanticizing, we're adding into the exoticism of the dating of the terraces. But going back to who originally suggested that the terraces were at least 2,000 years old, were the two pioneer anthropologists in the Philippines. That's Roy Barton and H. Otley Beyer. We've been crediting Beyer for saying that the terraces are at least 2,000 years old, but it was actually Barton who initially said that the terraces are 2,000 years old, at least on record. That was in 1919. And it wasn't until 1955 that Beyer said that the terraces are 2,000 years old. And this is because it's connected to his 1947 publication that articulated the waves of migration theory in the origins of the Ifugao Rice Terraces. And so succeeding scholars, ethnohistorians, historians, anthropologists, have argued that the terraces could be much younger than what Barton and Beyer have suggested. And all of these arguments are based on observations and also ethnography, analysis of oral history, but nothing, no one was able to break the myth of the 2,000-year-old model. Even when Maher did his archaeological work in the 1960s, and he couldn't find any evidence of rice agriculture predating the arrival of the Spanish, the myth of the 2,000-year-old model continued. One of the more important data sets that we are using here is the absence of any Spanish description on the terraces. The Spanish were in the region as early as the 1600s, and they were in Ifugao in the mid 1700s. But it wasn't until 1801 that we see a clear indication of a description of the existence of the terraces. So for over 100 years, there wasn't any mention of the terraces in any Spanish documents. And as you've seen the photos, they are something to write home about, but no one wrote about the terraces in their reports. So the recent data sets that we have, starting in 2007 for my PhD dissertation, and also including Robert Maher's work in the 1960s, Conklin's work from 60 to 80s, and Bodner working in another region in the Philippines in the 1980s. We're not getting any evidence that wet rice was present in the region. So the saying that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence works here, but there is just really total absence of any indication of the presence of rice. When we're looking for wet rice, we can look for weeds, grasses that are associated with rice, but we're not really finding that in Ifugao. We're also looking at spatial and energetics modeling, looking at how fast or how long it would take the Ifugaos to construct a terrace system. We're using ethnography, and Marlon can talk more about community stories that provides a glimpse on the connection between generational memory and the expansion and probably origins of the terraces. And so I've already mentioned this a while ago. So Maher, Conklin, Bodner, and the Ifugao Archaeological project. And to bring everything into one image, this is what we have so far in 5 sites in Ifugao. there's really a total absence of any evidence of rice below the second layer. So before 1640 in calendar years. And what we have before that is the dominance of taro in the archaeological record. So we have a publication a few years ago that talks about why taro is the first cultivar in the region. So probably the whole Philippines, not just Ifugao. We have an energetics data that suggests that if the Batad Rice Terraces, this terrace system, could have been constructed by 4.5 terrace workers working 7.5 hours a day, 6 days a week in less than 200 years. But of course, there would be more than 4.5 people working here. And so this system could have been constructed within 10, maybe 20 years. So what are the implications of these new findings? The idea that the Ifugao were isolated reinforces the racism. So we have this concept of pericolonialism, that you have groups on the periphery of colonized world who were able to change, shift their socio-political organization, their culture, to adapt to the colonial reality. And this is what we're seeing in Ifugao. Most Filipinos who are educated or products of our educational system talk about the Ifugaos and other highland groups as original Filipinos. And that's a racist description, because it means that the Ifugaos and other highland groups were unchanging since the Spanish showed up. And the concept of pericolonialism would argue against that, because we're finding a lot of imported ceramics, beads, tradeware ceramics that would have been obtained by the Ifugao in the lowlands. There's no magic that those ceramics would just show up in Ifugao and not pass through the lowlands. So the shift to wet rice cultivation also facilitated their active resistance against the Spanish. In the 1800s alone, there were at least 12 punitive expeditions sent by the Spanish to punish the Ifugao for raiding and ransacking the trade route or the supply route between Cagayan and Pampanga. And they tried to establish centers in the region, but they were never able to do that. They were repelled every time, and they finally gave up when the new colonial overlord showed up in 1898. And so these models that are being taught to Filipino kids reify the isolationist models and in turn reinforces racism. And what we think is that this new archaeological data sets provide an empowering narrative, because with this archaeological, ethnographic, and spatial data sets, as well as community stories, all indicate that the Ifugao and other highland Filipinos were not mere spectators during the colonial period, but they were part of the colonial enterprise. They co-opted the colonial enterprise to resist colonialism. I think that's. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. That's really interesting. Could I get a reaction from Marlon? Stephen mentioned about community stories about the Ifugao, of how the rice terraces were constructed, and what are those stories like?
The Ifugaos are predominantly good at two things during the pre-American regime. We're good at war, and then we're good in our oral literature. So you've known of the you've heard of the Ifugaos with all their epic chants, their rituals. Most of our community stories told from grandparents to grandchildren, though most of these traditional systems of learning ceased when we started going to the formal schools. But we were able to a few of our elders still exist, and they still hold stories of how our ancestors started constructing the terraces. So, for instance, if you go to Batad, this is one of the more popularly known rice terraces clusters. You still have the mubaki, or the traditional priests who they are culture bearers, and they would narrate stories of how the first ancestors of the Batad Ifugaos started to when they started to inhabit the village, and when they started constructing the terraces. So, well, they say they came from a neighboring village, the village of Kambudu, and then they went down to Batad during one of their hunting trips, and because they were brothers, one of the brothers said, "This would be a nice place to establish a village. So maybe we should invite some of our relatives to stay here." So they brought, and then they started constructing their terraces. So this is just one example of how the community remembers the stories of how the terraces were constructed. And then we have another one, and probably a potential archaeological site, because we've seen the area, and it looks like probably one of the older terrace clusters in Ifugao. And this is in the southern part. And this is clearer as to how it started, because the elders, the remaining elders who know of the story, said the early Ifugaos moved to that area to avoid the Spaniards. And this particular area is very near the lowlands. And these lowland provinces now, these were strongholds of the Spaniards. So this is in Asipulu. So we have this. So we now have this terraces cluster, not really known outside the municipality, but it is in an area where the existing inhabitants are not known for being terrace farmers, because the original terrace farmers of this particular area moved on to another village. So these are classic stories, community history. We still have them, which is which makes it very important for us to do documentation of these community memories being held by few remaining elders. Of course, as Father Lambrecht, one of the more prolific writers during the early American period, he wrote extensively about the oral literature of the Ifugaos. And it was actually him who suggested that based from the Hudhud chants, the Hudhud is one of the epic chants of the Ifugao, inscribed as one of the masterpieces of the oral intangible heritage of humanity by UNESCO. In his analysis of the Hudhud chants, he said that the rice terraces cannot be that old, referring to 2000, basing from the lexicon of the Hudhud chants. So much of our oral tradition is disappearing, actually. We've lost a lot of our sacred stories because the elders have passed on, and it's mainly because of education also that these were not recorded. But now we're making use of the modern educational system to actually document what remains of our oral literature. So now when we started working with the Dr. Acabado on this, and then every time results from the laboratory comes in as to the dating of the artifacts that we were able to get from the different sites, we would compare this with what we have in the stories of the community, and then it fits the I mean the scientific evidence, the archaeological evidence fits more into our oral history, which makes the archaeological findings more valid, and also it gives more meaning to our oral literature that has been forgotten, that's actually being neglected by the educational system, because no one. We only have very few Ifugao scholars who actually worked on the oral literature. We can count about 3 or 4 of them who pioneered the documentation of the oral traditions of the Ifugaos. And they all passed away now, and we only have a few, like 2, 3 people working on this. But at least the current educational system started acknowledging the importance of our oral history. And then for our part in our organization, we're actually using it along with the findings of the Ifugao Archaeological project to give it a more emphatic value, because when you come up with the instructional materials with learning modules that only talks about the superstitions of the ancestors, then no one actually pays attention to it. But if you mention archaeology, and not to flatter Dr. Acabado, but if you mention Dr. Acabado and UCLA, it gives more relevance to what we're talking about. So the Ifugao Archaeological project actually is like it boosted our advocacy to document and to study more about our oral literature of the Ifugaos. I'll stop here.
It seems like the Ifugao knew all along that it wasn't 2,000 years old. But how's the general reaction been from the public about the supposed new dates of the rice terraces? I say supposed now because, as Stephen has pointed out, it's this redating of the Ifugao terraces is not revolutionary. You've pointed out several instances where scholars before you have said that it's not as old as 2,000 years. So I'd like to hear reactions from both of you.
Okay, should I go?
Stephen?
All right. So in 2007, when I did my dissertation research and I came up with a publication in 2009, almost no one, even the reviewers of the publication, ignored my arguments because I was just focusing on one site, and it was an hypothesis testing exercise. And then when I came back in 2012 and 2013, I think Marlon was actually ready to take my head off because or the community, because I'm impinging on their identity. So for so long, since the establishment of the first school in Kiangan by the Americans, they were told that their terraces are old, and that their terraces were actually influenced by the retreating Chinese pirates, Limahong, which is part of Philippine history, but it entered this imagination of there's really nothing new and invented in the Philippines, that everything came from the outside. And even if you have these rice terraces, there was still this idea that they were brought in from somewhere else. And so when I went there in 2012, I still remember having this intense discussions with Uncle June and Uncle Maning, the two local, very influential historians in Ifugao, and it took a while. I think it took until 2014 when they started agreeing to our conversations. And I think Uncle June, before he died, actually took that argument that the terraces were much younger than they were told. And so that was the initial reaction. But most of the negative reactions that I got, at least in 2015, were from nationalist historians and not from the community.
Marlon, what about you? What did the Ifugao have to say about this? Did you really try to take his head off?
Yeah, and crush his body to pieces. No, well, when we first started working with Dr. Acabado, it was not. He already insinuated on the possibility that the rice terraces could be younger than 2000. Of course, like, yeah, we know that. We know that 2000, the 2000 year narrative has no scientific basis. So it could be younger. Maybe 1000, maybe 1500. It's when he said maybe 4. No, maybe 500. So there's this, it's a knee-jerk reaction to, because we didn't think it was that young. We didn't think it was that old, but we didn't think it was that young. And then, of course, we started looking up again the books in about Ifugao history and a wide Philippine history. And then, if we consider using his the 400-year-old thing, and then everything comes together, Ifugao history suddenly becomes part of Philippine history. Because when you start talking about 2000 years, it doesn't fit into the national history of the Philippines, which is why you don't see Ifugao in Philippine history books. Ifugao children, including my generation and my parents' generations, have been fed history of the Philippines except the Ifugaos. So that's actually how our organization got inspired to actively participate in the archaeological project, because this is revealing ourselves. This is literally digging up the history of our people. And I think this is the only chance we have. This is probably the first chance we have to actually participate in something that has something to do with our identity, with our culture as Ifugaos. Because everything that was fed to us for the past 100 years came from Imperial Manila. So everything that has been taught to us is, the standard national. These are national standards provided by the capital. So we learn about everything. We study Greek history, we study Asian history, Southeast Asian history, Philippine history, but never about Ifugao history. So when we started working on the Ifugao Archaeological project, it dawned on us that we need to do this, because it matches with there's always this, how should I call when we talk about oral narratives of the community, it's separated from the formal education system. The formal education system would not recognize the history being passed down by our elders. No, so they don't talk about that in schools. So when we came up, when we started working with the archaeological project, I thought maybe if they see archaeology, maybe if they see Dr. Acabado in the written articles, then perhaps they would start considering, they'd start to rethink the relevance, the significance of the oral history of the Ifugaos. And that's how it started. And actually, that's when we started juxtaposing the findings of the archaeological project and what remains of our community memory. And then it fits, it comes together. So science and the oral traditions of the Ifugaos are coming together through the archaeological project. Of course, you convinced, especially for people who are used to, Ifugao was started to admit tourists in the 1970s. So it's now a major tourism destination in the north. And of course, if you're a tour guide, you're a hotel owner, and every time tourists come to your place, you would always be proud of say, our rice terraces are 2,000 years old. It's more appealing in the context of tourism. It doesn't want to be as old as, the Great Wall of China, some other ancient relics of old civilizations. But it is totally wrong because, when they start realizing what it means that it's younger, when they start comprehending the implications to their own culture that our rice terraces did not exist for 2,000 years, then they would accept that. And we've seen a lot of converts. We only call them converts because they were rabid as mad dogs when we first started talking to them. We've done a lot of community presentations. We gather the members of the community, and then we discuss, we present the findings of the archaeological project. And for all first timers, it's always like, no, we're older than that. But then we start talking about it more, and the more that they absorb it intellectually, it becomes more acceptable, and it makes more sense actually than the 2,000 years old narrative. So we don't have any illusion that this is going to be instant, that the Ifugaos would accept this hook, line, and sinker overnight. But we are sure that given the educational status of the Ifugaos, more than 90% are literate, they would soon get it from the scientific perspective and understand that it's actually more meaningful. It gives more value, recognizing the actual younger age of the rice terraces gives it more value. Not because the UNESCO says that it has been sustained through thousands of generations. These are mere words. But if they come to fully comprehend the implications of the archaeological findings, then this can better fit their cultural memory. Actually, it can better fit the stories of their grandfathers, their grandmothers. And then it would make more sense. It will take time, but we are going there.
Marlon should write that as our chapter 8.
How are these new findings being integrated into the education system? You've mentioned that perhaps part of the problem of the current situation is that the way that it's being taught, that the rice terraces are being taught to the national consciousness is part of that problem. So are there any efforts to change the basic education curriculum?
Yes, we're actually doing it now. So we have this, in 2013, the Department of Education in the Philippines came up with the change in curriculum. So it's K to 12, and it was a department order then, but in 2013, our Public Act was issued by the National Legislature, establishing the Indigenous Peoples Education curriculum. So it's like all areas having Indigenous peoples would have to come up with a curriculum that better fits the culture and the area. So we call this Indigenous Peoples Education. Although our organization started to lobby for the inclusion of Ifugao indigenous knowledge early as 2006 or maybe 2004, But it's only in 2013 that there was actually a national recognition that you can actually include Ifugao history into the formal schools curriculum. So 2013 as against 1908, when we first started having our classes, when we first started having our formal schools in Ifugao. So we were fed the history of a different people. Of course, it's nice to learn about the history of the Philippines, but it's much nicer if we also learn history of the Ifugao. And not just history, the local culture, our indigenous knowledge systems, our traditional customs and practices. So we started working on this when we worked with the Ifugao State University, because we have a local university, and they piloted, they tested several classes using classes on Ifugao indigenous knowledge. We were able to come up with a textbook on the first of its kind, a textbook on Ifugao indigenous knowledge systems and practices. Now, with the first one, we had that before in about 2012. And that time, there was no mention of the younger narrative of Rice Terraces. But we updated the just this year. Hopefully, it come out this year, because we finished working on this early part of this year. So, well, with the community quarantine still on in the Philippines, it's a bit difficult to really come up with the prints. But we hope to come up with that, because we have revised that and we have integrated the findings of the Ifugao Archaeological project in the textbook. So that will be the first textbook on Ifugao culture where we included the findings of the Ifugao Archaeological project. So they'll be using that as a reference. It will be a general reference for learners in Ifugao. So, and that, of course, and we are also doing teachers trainings on, because now they have to do the localization and contextualization of their learning materials. And then our organization, the Save the Ifugao Terraces movement, have been conducting teachers trainings on this. And of course, one focus is on the findings of the Ifugao Archaeological project. So again, this will take time. The change, the shift, because even the teachers are like, it's so difficult to have been teaching it for the past years that we're 2,000 years old. And what would our pupils say when we say, oh, sorry, that's not 2,000, it's 400. But I said, well, you can always state that because of the archaeological project, because of some archaeological digs that we conducted, we found out that we were wrong all along. So anyway, we're actually into the educational system now, working with the Department of Education to make this make the findings more mainstream.
So I have a question from Rod Lee on Facebook, who asks, how will this new information affect the UNESCO listing? Does this new date affect the status of the UNESCO listing?
Well, it's not an archaeological site. So the dating is irrelevant to the nomination and the listing. But it's up to the national government, I think NCCA, the National Commission on Culture and the Arts, to initiate the changing of the narrative. And of course, the National Museum, as the experts, the government experts in archaeology, would have to sign off on it. But in terms of UNESCO, I'm on ICAM, International Committee on Archaeological Heritage Management. If it's not an archaeological site, the dating is not relevant. At least that's but I'm not with UNESCO.
Go ahead.
As per the dossier of the Rice Terraces of the Philippine Cordillera, we passed the 3 criteria in the World Heritage Guidelines. First is criterion 3, rice terraces are a dramatic testimony to a community's sustainable and primarily communal system of rice production based on harvesting water from forest-clad mountaintops and creating stone terraces and ponds, a system that has survived for 2 millennia. They can just remove the 2 millennia part and then, and then the criterion 4, which says rice terraces are a memorial to the history and labor of more than 1,000 generations of small-scale farmers. They'll just have to remove the generations. But that's not actually the focus of criterion 4. Criterion 5, the rice terraces are an outstanding example of land use that resulted from a harmonious interaction between people and its environment, which has changed a steep terrace landscape of great aesthetic beauty, so and so, blah, blah, blah. Now, in these three criteria, nothing says it is of outstanding universal value because it's 2,000 years old. The mention of 2 millennia and 1,000 generations of small-scale farmers doesn't invalidate the outstanding universal value of the terraces because the focus is more on the community's sustainable and primary communal system of rice production. It's more on the community working together and having a landscape based on a delicate and sustainable use of natural resources. It has nothing to do with antiquity. It has nothing to do with the 2,000-year-old thing. So I actually asked this when we had this, we had a meeting, or there was a conference in Europe, and I personally asked the head of UNESCO, of the World Heritage Committee, because I told her that we have this, Rosler, we have this new archaeological finding. Well, it's not a new finding, but we have a new archaeological data saying that the rice terraces are not 2,000 years old. Yet the outstanding universal value statement of UNESCO says it is 2,000. So does it change anything? I said no, but if you want to put that younger than 2,000 thing, then you just have to rewrite the dossier. So really, it has no impact on the outstanding universal value as far as UNESCO is concerned. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, it's actually if we were to rewrite the outstanding universal value, it would make it more valuable. If we say the rice terraces were actually used by a particular group of people to repel any colonial attempts by a foreign power, by a superpower at that. So because we have this thing that, part of our interpretation of the findings of the archaeological project is that when the Ifugaos went up the mountains, well, these were the present-day Ifugao were still part of the ancestral domain of the Ifugaos. They inhabited both highland and lowland areas. So when they went up the mountains to construct the terraces, it was not an escape thing. You know, constructing stone-walled and earthen-walled terraces is not escape agriculture. They were there to stay. They were there to make their stand against the Spanish government. And this is something that has never been told in the history of the Philippines. You know, when you talk about Philippine history, everything is about this the colonial period, and then before the revolution, it was about a revolt of this, revolt of that, revolt of this, revolt of that, and most of these revolts actually failed. Yet for 300 years, most people of the northern mountains of the Cordillera region actually successfully defended their remaining strongholds. Why are we not reading this in Philippine history? Yes, this is a victory for the Filipinos. We only talk about the fall of this, the fall of that, how this failed. All these heroes died, all these national heroes died, trying to defend, trying to get back their freedom. And yet we have these peoples in the mountains who were successful all this time. So that's what we're trying also to change in not just rewriting the narrative of UNESCO, but more so the narrative of our national history.
I'm going to throw out another question from Rosalie on Facebook. And it's more archaeological, but from the new data and analysis, do you have any information that the Spaniards influenced the way the terraces were built, or was this purely an Ifugao innovation?
Well, the Spanish didn't have anything to do with the terraces. So the model that we were looking at and the explanatory model that we're using is that you have Ifugao communities down in the Magat Valley, and this is supported indirectly by Spanish documents. So they talk about rice terracing in the Magat Valley. They talk about anthropomorphic figures like the bulul, actually a bulul description down in the Magat Valley and during the Dasmariñas expeditions in the Magat Valley. So you have potentially this rice producers down in the lowlands in the 15th, the 17th century. And according to Blair and Robertson, there were only 2 regions in the Philippines that were practicing wet rice or irrigated rice. And that's the present day Magat Valley, Nueva Vizcaya, Isabela, and Bicol. And so when they came back 50 years later, out of the 149 villages that they documented, only 50 villages remained. And so they probably went up to the mountains to consolidate their economic and political resources that allowed them to militarily repel attacks by the Spanish. And in 1735, the initial mention of Old Kiangan, and then in the late 1700s, they said that there were about 4,000 people in a very small village of the Kiangan village, and then 2,000 more in 4 satellite villages. So 6,000 people in that small valley. And if you compare that to the present day Manila, where Intramuros is, when Legazpi went to Manila, there were only 2,000 people there. So the move to the mountain was an active decision to consolidate the resources. And so the construction of the terraces was an innovation by the Ifugaos. It was counterintuitive because the Spanish valued wet rice. They taxed wet rice. They used rice as a major payment commodity. But so if you shift to wet rice cultivation, then you're inviting attacks from the colonial power. No, in short, no, there were no influence from the Spanish technology.
Thank you. Just a reminder to all of you who are tuning in, this is the SPAPA Sesh with Marlon Martin and Professor Stephen Acabado talking about the Ifugao Rice Terraces. If you're listening on Zoom, you could post a question in the Q&A. And if you're on Facebook, you can leave a comment and I'll get the questions fed to me. I have another question from Zoom from Panga Ardiyansha, who asks, most Ifugao still working to cultivate rice in the terraces? And how does the new dating influence the agricultural tradition in the region? Marlon, you look like you want.
Oh, well, maybe, how do they influence? I don't think the farmers even care. And honestly, of course, they're engaged in the tourism industry. Because that would be changing the entire spiel on, when they introduce the rice terraces. But, well, basing from our consultations, they don't actually care. If you ask farmers, do you know that our rice terraces no longer 2,000 years old? And they would say, but it's still old. And I said, yeah, it's old. You know, I was asked this question several times. How do you feel as an Ifugao that this Dr. Acabado from Bicol is saying that your rice terraces are not 2,000 years old? And I said, well, we never said it's 2,000 years old. Whenever our grandparents would tell stories about the rice terraces, they would say, oh, your great-great-grandfather this, your great-great-grandmother this constructed the rice terraces. They never said 2,000, they never said 1,000 or 500 or 400. We don't really care about that. It's for educated Ifugaos who have gotten used to the idea that it's 2,000 years old, and you know, when you say 2,000 years old, you put it in the class of all these popular tourist destinations, you know, ancient products of ancient civilizations. And that's I think was where the resentment is coming from. So like, okay, so we're not as old as, you know, the pyramids of Giza, or, you know, some you know, popular tourist destinations in some movies or something. So that's where the resentment is coming from. Actually, it's not really because they don't want to. But you can't blame us. You can't blame us for initially resisting the dating, the actual dating. But for most farmers, I don't think it matters. For most Ifugao farmers, they don't give. It doesn't matter to them really.
Thanks. I have a question from Michelle on Facebook who asks, were constructing the terraces using tools and were the tools and technologies of the ancient times considered in the energetics modeling? So this is a question for Stephen.
Well, no. We tried to, but cultures change, and attempting to use what Bayer mentioned as basic implements is contributing to the exoticism of the terraces. So when we did the energetics modeling, the construction in Bular and in the IPAD Center, we documented the number of work hours, the environmental parameters, the soil displaced when they're working on the terracing. But they were using probably similar or comparable tools. Of course, they're not using backhoes. It would have been better if they were using backhoes because it would have been faster. But they were using the same, almost the same tools, like spades. But of course, we'll have to bring the rocks from with trucks. It's a torture for people to bring those rocks on their backs. But we can come up with an algorithm to determine, at least on a one-to-one correlation with everything else being equal, with a model for the expansion of the terraces. So it's not very specific, but it could be within 10 years.
Another question from Athena on Zoom. I'm going to read this question, it's a bit long. In the Visayas, particularly in Bohol and in Antique, I observed some dry terraces. In Anda, Bohol, they plant root crops on the terraced mountainside. Are there any older dry terraces in Luzon or in other parts of the country? And could it be that there was a shift from dry crops to wet rice terraces?
Well, I guess this is for me. So it is archaeologically supported that most of the cropping system in the Philippines, even when the Spanish showed up, were based on Sweden agriculture, so dry crop, taro or dry rice. So the earliest rice in the Philippines is dated to about like 3900, 3500 in Andarayan. But that's not wet rice, that's dry rice. Contrary to the Nature article that came out, Shuttler and Snow and Shuttler specifically said that Andarayan rice is dry rice. And now with taro, you have wet and dry types of taro, and the wet type of taro can actually grow on dry Sweden. And so with the shift to wet rice agriculture, wet rice requires a specific form of social organization because you need to have a demographic impetus. You need to be able to control the flow of water at a specific life cycle of rice. It requires a lot of labor. And so why fix something that's not broken if you have dry rice or dry crops to wet rice when you don't get a lot of benefits? And so I think a lot of the farming, the crops that are being eaten by Filipinos back then when they're not Filipinos back then, were mostly root crops and dry rice.
A question for both of you. Is there a plan to open the archaeological sites that you open for tourists? It might be interesting to show tourists this is where we changed history. Or is there a place to show visitors to the Ifugao Terraces, once tourism opens, that this might be a tourist attraction that you can show this is the place where you worked on dating the Ifugao Terraces?
Well, actually, we have the major site, like the old Kiyangan village site, it's private property. But the municipal government came up with a huge billboard beside the road near the site, announcing it's being the old Kiyangan village and an archaeological site. Because the municipality of Kiangan is actually is also doing its tourism activities. So probably, but after we were done with our archaeological digs, we would put it back the way we found it. These are active rice fields. Although as much as we want to, to make it like an exhibit area, like an open air museum, these are still private properties, and as per Ifugao customary law, you don't just air it as a public area. But anyway, in the other sites like the in Nagakadan, in Hapaw, in Hungduang, these are usual tourist areas. So you can always go there once the ban on tourism is lifted in the area.
So if I may put a personal comment here, I was just thinking about how this discussion about the new dates of the site is very similar to how we think about the current COVID situation and how there's always new information from scientists coming up. And there's always, for a member of the general public, sometimes there's always this confusion about what science is. First scientists say this, and then now scientists say that. So what lessons can you draw from this about what it means to be an archaeologist presenting new information that might not necessarily agree with the current thinking, the popular thinking?
So I think we can share, we just published something last week about the nature of science and the nature of archaeological framing of an archaeological research. I think what we mentioned is that archaeology and science for that matter doesn't seek the truth. We test hypotheses, and in this case, you're testing the idea that the terraces were 2,000 years old. And then when we didn't find any evidence of an older dating, then we came up with our own hypothesis, which was supported by data. And in terms of just changing truth, the tentative truths, I don't think scientists and us, for example, would be depressed if a new set of data comes in, because that means that the model that we developed did not stand the test of scientific inquiry. And so for scientists, that's how our lives work. The world will not end if our models become obsolete because of new data, which means that we really need to before we conclude, before we come up with a generalization, a tentative truth, then we need to make sure that our foundation is solid. Otherwise, then you'll be, you just keep on changing your narrative. So there are two types of scientists or scholars. One who would fight for their model all their life, and the other would be, oh yeah, we made an error, so life will move on.
I think that's the fair point. As an archaeologist, there's always a sense of humility that you might be proven wrong later, even though you come up with something new at the start, or someone will have a different view and which might be supported by data. It's an interesting point. I'm gonna go to, we're getting a lot of questions now, from P. Sebastian on Zoom, who asks, do Ifugaos use modern technology for farming? Do they use seeds and farm tractors? And is there any law or practice that prevents it? Marlon.
As much as the terrain would allow, yeah. But no, tractors, the mountain climbing tractor yet, so no. But we have the Poland less in areas where you can actually make use of handheld machineries. I don't think the technology is more of the kind of rice that they're planting. Of course, being a World Heritage, at least for the World Heritage areas, there's a certain degree of protection, especially in the use of modern agricultural implements or modern chemicals. There's a certain degree of regulation. We don't have a law prohibiting the use of modern technology because I don't think that's needed. And until somebody comes up with a spider tractor, then maybe we would need to come up with a legislation banning the use of modern technology in the area. But as we say, the Ifugao Rice Terraces these are living cultural landscapes. And if at some point in time that the Ifugao decides to make use of modern things to continue cultivating the rice terraces, then why would anyone prohibit it? These are living cultural landscapes, not museums, not relics of the past. These are still alive. And the only way to keep it alive is for it to keep up with the modern times, the use of modern technology included.
So I've got a follow-up question for you. This is from Krista on Zoom. Oh, I know you, Krista. 4 or 5 years ago, Ifugao rice producers was only enough to self-sustain the Ifugao communities. Is this still the case at the moment? And if you have a surplus of rice supply, would you be able to use it as a diplomacy tool to promote both the new dating and the intangible cultural heritage of the Ifugao?
Well, I'm sure Dr. Acabado had some have something to say about this. The rice of the Ifugaos is a prestige crop. It's mainly for ritual and not really for public consumption. But ever since we had our rice terraces, even our grandfathers, only a few people in the village would have a surplus in their harvest. Most of the inhabitants of a certain village would only eat rice during short periods of the year. So it's not an item that's easily accessible or readily available to everyone. And even now, although the Department of Agriculture now encourages the sale of tinawon rice, we call it tinawon. These are the early varieties planted in the terraces, because it pays it's like say 4 or 5 times more expensive than the regular commercial rice. But the rice terraces can only produce so much. Like it's funny because sometimes we get orders from Manila asking for like 2 tons, 3 tons of Ifugao rice, and we're like, okay, that's the entire rice harvest for this year. So we cannot produce it at a huge commercial level. The population, the Ifugao population is increasing. The rice fields are not getting any wider. While the maintenance of the rice terraces is it's actually a very contentious issues among the new Ifugaos now. I mean, if you send people to universities, you don't expect them to come back and be rice farmers, although that's what we're trying. But no, perhaps if we come up with a system that would really compensate farmers of the rice terraces enough to sustain their families, send their children to school, and for them to live modern lives, then perhaps the rice terraces would continue to live on forever. But the way we're going now, perhaps in a few years' time, after this generation, because we have like really old farmers in most of the World Heritage areas. It's an issue of adapting to the modern times, and people moving on or clinging on to the relics of the past. No.
Cool. We are coming to the end of our session. I was just reminded that we had put it to 11:30 and not 12. So maybe let me end off with a question for the two of you from Jesse Tuason. He asked Dr. Acabado, but I think I should ask this to Marlon too. If you were to tell your study findings to grade 3 students, what would be your top 3 messages?
Can you say that again? That's a bit difficult.
If you were to summarize your findings to grade 3 students, so I suppose 9 or 10-year-olds, what would be your 3 main messages?
First, we have this when we are training teachers to, and these are teachers from K to 12. So they're supposed to come up with they are the teachers. I'm not a teacher, so I'm not really familiar with how we are going to deliver a message to a grade 1 pupil and the same message to a grade 2 pupil or a grade 3 until like somebody in grade 12. Of course, they have all these different levels of understanding as to how lessons are taught to a particular age group. But perhaps if I were, since I'm asked the questions, how I'm going to share this the findings to 10-year-olds. We have stories. We have Ifugao stories on how our rice fields were constructed, and I believe it's, and we have been teaching this to our teachers, our Indigenous peoples education teachers, on how they would get the attention. But of course, you would not be presenting the archaeological findings of Dr. Acabado in a chart, but you can tell stories. You can tell stories that, and we have started compiling all these stories on how our rice fields were, our rice terraces were constructed. So one example would be there's this. We have the sacred myth. It's recited during certain rice rituals. Now it's a lot of Ifugaos, young Ifugaos do not know this because these are in archaic Ifugao words, but we were able to get the gist of these sacred myths, and it tells about the story of how our ancestors changed the crops in the rice in the terraces from taro to rice. So now you can start with that because it has characters familiar to the Ifugao. So you say you have this Bugan and who married Kabigat from the sky world when they lived went to live in the village of Kiyangan. Our ancestor Kabigat said, "Oh, but we are going to have a lot of children, and taro would not be enough to support us. So maybe I should go back to the sky world and ask for rice from my father, and then we would plant it in our fields." So this is one story where you can actually narrate, and then you can start including the findings of the archaeological project. So, instead of saying there was taro before rice, according to Dr. Acabado, perhaps they can hear that when they go to middle school or high school. So it's somebody as teachers have to be really creative in doing this, and they're actually having a very difficult time, translating all these cultural things into the classroom setting. I myself would back out from a teaching job to do all these things. But as I've said, these are birthing pains. Give it like 5-6 years, and then if our teachers would be trained enough, then it would be easy because this is their history. These are the stories of their people. This is their culture, and it would come out naturally. You don't have any difficulty explaining it to a grade 1 learner or to a high school learner. And that's what I hope.
No, I echo Marlon, and it's really hard. No, it's been 4 months now for us, almost 4 months with homeschooling, and I've been teaching for more than 15 years, but I just can't articulate my thoughts to my 7-year-old and my 14-year-old in terms of teaching. So it's hard, but I'll probably focus on what Marlon said, is character building, strengthening the identity of the kids as Ifugao. There's this study among immigrant kids, and among immigrant kids, you live on two worlds, and sometimes you really don't know where you are. And for those who have a solid identity, that they know what they are, they become more successful later in life. And so for marginalized populations who were on the edges of history or not even part of history, their identity, their self-esteem about who they are when they go down to like Manila, they think of themselves as different. That's because of what's been taught in school. So in this case, following up on Marlon's idea, is that you link it with oral history. Too much science is probably not applicable, will not work for 10-year-olds. So a story about Bugan and Wigan, a story about the old Kangan village, the YouTube video that we just posted is an example. So it's a co-creation of knowledge with communities.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Marlon. I think I should call this, bring this session to a close. And First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us this morning or this evening for you, Stephen. I'm very sorry for all our viewers on Facebook and Zoom if I wasn't able to get to your questions. Would you be able to answer questions post if I send them to you, and then we will try to find a way to post the questions online and put your replies over there. We've got a few questions that we weren't able to address. I'd like to thank all of you on Facebook and on Zoom for joining us. We will be posting a recording of this talk on our website and on Facebook and on YouTube, so you can come back to it again. I think this has been a very useful discussion. I'd like to invite you again for our next sesh, which will be on Monday, 20th of July, where I'll be talking to Mr. Sokrati from the Apsara Authority in Cambodia to talk about the new discoveries from Angkor. And you can go on our website, www.simiospafa.org/sesh, or find the link on Facebook and join us there. So thank you very much. Have a good morning, good evening, good lunch, all of you. And we will see you again soon in a couple of weeks. Thank you.